Like a lot of critics, I kind of came in the side door through kind of filmmaking and screenwriting. I did a master's in screenwriting at the London Film School and hacked it out for a couple of years as a sort of freelance screenwriter and script editor, mostly working on other people's scripts that I didn't like very much, and it was getting a bit demoralizing while I was sort of trying to hawk my feature script that wasn't really going anywhere. And I'd always written reviews as a kind of hobbyist, and I kept kind of film diaries that way. And I thought I could sort of start turning that into a bit of side money. And it was in 2008 that a US site I read and liked a lot called In Contention put out a call for kind of new contributors, just occasional ones. And I emailed them and said, it might be useful for you to have someone in London. And they were like, yeah, actually, we hadn't thought of that, but sure. And I started kind of doing just the odd bit for them, and especially with kind of European festival coverage, that was, something they didn't have someone in place to do previously. And they'd hired a few other people at the same time, but none of them really worked out. So it really became me and Chris Tapley, my colleague there. It sort of became a two-man show. And yeah, the sort of readers seemed to like me, and I kind of developed my voice there. And then in the next couple of years, I was sort of in this weird no man's land because I was writing for this US publication that was quite well regarded in the industry in Los Angeles, but no one here knew it. So it took a while for kind of UK outlets to kind of cotton on to what I was doing. And I think it was first sort of Heat and then Time Out sort of started commissioning me for stuff. And it was by then that had sort of become the day job. And I was kind of writing scripts on the side instead. And I think it was in 2011 or so that Variety, I'd kind of got to know them over the festival circuit and kind of made a lot of contacts that way. And they liked my style. And they asked me kind of then if I would be a sort of UK stringer for them, because at that point, they had two other kind of permanent UK critics. And that sort of worked as an arrangement, and kind of over the years, I started doing more for them. And then last year, they kind of took me on full time. So I've never been one of those people who sort of say, how can you write about film if you've never made one? It's like they're two separate disciplines, and there are lots of brilliant filmmakers who couldn't write about film for toffee. So it's not so much that, but it's having written scripts or whatever. I kind of think very intently, even while I'm watching any film, about narrative, and I always kind of watch a film and I'm kind of tracing it back to the blueprint of it and how it would have been on the page, and if something's gone wrong, where in that process it might have gone wrong. So I wouldn't say I'm more sensitive to that than a critic who sort of has never done an inch of screenwriting, but it does inform how I think about film very heavily. I think film criticism, it's several things. At the most basic level, it's information. Yeah, to readers who want to kind of know what they should be seeing this weekend. Yeah, describing a film, evoking what it is, what it's about, but obviously not too much. What's interesting about it, what doesn't work about it, and from that, you're kind of allowing them to draw their own judgment as to whether to see it or not. At a deeper level, I think if you're engaging with film as an art form, you're giving film scholars and filmmakers themselves kind of perspective and interpretation of a film they've made or a film they've seen, and giving them not necessarily a different way to think about it, but an extra perspective that may not be the same as theirs, and to which they can kind of line their own thoughts up against. I always think there's a huge difference between writing film criticism for people who are reading it before they see the film and for people reading it after they see the film. I think those are two very different disciplines, and both really necessary. For example, the kind of academic sight and sound film comment style writing, I will always go to those reviews after I've seen a film and kind of use it as kind of prods to when I'm kind of forming my own thoughts and my own opinion. Well, because Variety is an industry paper, your primary audience, increasingly it's not the only audience, because especially since Variety became a magazine, it's kind of got more of a sort of public readership now. But still, your primary audience is industry types, producers, studio execs, who are reading a film review because they want to know either how it's going to do, or if it's at a festival, if it's, if it has a future in the market. And so it's a sort of interesting balance of reviewing a film, both, as a work of art, as a film, and as a kind of commercial entity. And that can be a difficult balance to strike, because sometimes there's a film you really, really love and you really want to champion it, but you also in the review have to admit that it's a tricky balance, because you want to serve the film and you want to kind of give it the best possible and the fairest possible reading and shot. But you are serving industry people who have a lot riding on whether they pick this film up or not, or if it's a film they're already kind of backing and distributing, how much they should invest in it. And yet you're also kind of increasingly now just reading for popular readership who still want to know if it's any good or not, and you have to kind of entertain them too. I've been wrong about a lot of films that I've reviewed for Variety, where I remember reviewing Battleship a couple of years ago and saying it was going to be a big, big hit, and it really was not. And then there are others where I've kind of written, I don't think this has much commercial potential, and lo and behold, it finds an audience. So it's what I was sort of talking about earlier about not pretending to have a completely authoritative voice, but just acting as a guide, and saying this is how it seems to me at the moment as someone who has some experience in this area, but it can go any way. If you see the kind of 5 stars jumping out at you on the page, then you're obviously going to read further more than you would if you saw 2 stars. So there's that. One of the great pleasures of Variety is actually not having to assign them, because I do find them difficult and overly stigmatizing. I mean, I think often there's a film that is, in terms of its artistic value, it may be a 3-star film, but you still think it's absolutely worth seeing. Because it's a kind of mixed success or kind of curate's egg, and those are often the most interesting films. But I think a lot of readers see 3 stars and write it off. But then there's also the kind of balance of, if you give something 5 stars just because you really love it, and you're implying then that you really all need to go out and see this, and it may not be the case. It may be something very esoteric that most people won't think is a 5-star film. So I find there's a kind of responsibility in assigning those ratings that doesn't always kind of sit that easily with me. I think if you're just using words and writing a review, it's far easier to kind of pick those nuances and give someone an idea of how it worked for you and how it might work for them. I think star ratings don't allow for that kind of dichotomy. But I still think they're probably a necessary evil for a lot of kind of popular outlets. What I tend to do, though, is if a publication like Empire asks me to review a film, I will say to them, if it's something that if my rating I think will not be compliant with their kind of editorial perspective, I might say, look, I think this is a 2-star film. I'm happy to write the review if you want it, but you may want to find another freelancer who's more willing to give it 4 stars. Which I think is fair, and they'll often say thanks for your honesty. I think it would fit our magazine maybe to be more positive on this film. It usually doesn't work the other way around. I don't think you usually have publications really wanting to be negative about a certain film. I think I'm sort of still of a newish generation that, I mean, I started at an internet site, so I've always written online. I've never written kind of in a print-only capacity. I think everything I write is still online somewhere. But I still think you're seeing it kind of change rapidly now, and I think the internet has increasingly brought such an increased focus on being first with a review and being the kind of, having your opinion right out there immediately, especially at festivals. As soon as that screening is over and everyone's rushing to, it's one thing to write the first review, but now with Twitter as well, it's kind of people practically, as the credits are rolling, getting their opinion out there immediately. So I think we had the Cannes director, Thierry Fremont, the other day complaining about how he felt films were kind of being judged or condemned kind of within minutes of their premiere, and the kind of advent of new media and Twitter has enabled that. I don't think it's necessarily that destructive, because I think people still want to kind of read in more detail and read nuance, but it's kind of up the pressure both on the films themselves and on critics to kind of formalize their opinions really quickly, which isn't always easy with, say a film like The Tree of Life, where you come out of it and you're like, I don't know yet. And it may be months before I know, or several viewings before I know. And I think new media is increasingly hostile to the more kind of considered opinion. We generally try to turn around a kind of full-length review within 3 hours of the screening finishing. If it's something lower profile, you might have, a day or so before they kind of pick up on, oh, wait, where's that one? But it's increasingly tighter. I mean, I'm not naturally a fast writer. I tend to kind of dawdle, and I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I kind of keep restructuring sentences and taking words out and in again. And so I've had to kind of adjust to just trusting my first instincts more and my first writerly instincts more, and sometimes saying, actually, that sentence is fine, it can stand. But the harder part is kind of forming an interpretation of a film, right like that. And I've kind of come to think of it as it's a first take, and it doesn't necessarily have to be forever. And at some point you could write something else or go back to it, even if it's on a sort of personal website or journal. And I don't think your words have to be kind of cast in stone forever. I think there's space for the re-review now in that kind of environment. I think film journalism, the kind of advent of the online outlet has given it, if anything, more of a life than it had before, because it's given us comment sections and feedback. And, readers now, depending on the outlet, they get very actively involved in that discussion. And a review is no longer just a review, it's a starting point for a conversation, especially on sort of more younger sort of skewing outlets where people get really heated and sort of huge side arguments start, especially on a sort of commercial, the kind of Marvel films, and whatever. Readers get very sort of het up and agitated about that. And on the one hand, it kind of can lower the tone of a conversation a bit, because people start hurling abuse and whatever. But I think overall it's constructive and it's productive. And I think you now as a writer have to think not only about your own review, but how is this going to start the conversation? And so I don't think you keep reading these think pieces about the death of film journalism, but then you look at the comment section on the review of the last Avengers film, and you're like, well, people are reading and they're responding and they seem to care. Even if it's like, this critic is a complete idiot because he hates the film, they care enough to kind of argue and write about that. So I think it's in a healthy state. I sort of talk to older film critics, and they seem to be making less now than they used to. I think even just sort of individual commission fees for reviews have kind of dropped. And I guess there is this kind of risk of thinking, well, if this kid is willing to write his opinions for free on a blog, we can use that. And there's a lot of exploitation of, especially younger writers going on. I still think, I'm optimistic that people will still think good writing is worth paying for, and that even if some kind of young talent emerges writing for free and people notice him and kind of want to grab his talent, and if it gets competitive, then they'll offer him more. So I think it's going to be increasingly difficult maybe to make a full-time living as a critic, but I don't think it's ever going to descend to a point where it's just like, oh, opinions aren't worth paying for. I think good writing will always be worth paying for. There are a lot of amateur critics, so-called, who are amateur only in the sense that they don't make their living from this, who are very good and who write better than a lot of so-called professional critics. So I think I judge someone as, I only throw around the word amateur when I think their writing is amateurish. But I think if I read someone and their opinion is kind of lucid and well kind of substantiated, and then if they've written a lot and they have you kind of, if they've established a voice for themselves, whether it's paid or not, to me that becomes kind of a professional qualification in a way. If it's someone whose writing you recognize and who you routinely read, even if they're not making a living from that, to me that counts as, a fully qualified critic. I think there have always been kind of standout female critics. Pauline Kael, I think, would be most people's kind of choice for, the greatest kind of signature critic of all time. I think it is slowly expanding and broadening, but probably not as quickly as we'd like. But I think publications are increasingly aware of it as an issue, and so they're seeking to kind of expand their kind of range of writers. So I think we will see change gradually. I mean, I think what was very encouraging, for example, was the last Pulitzer Prize ceremony. The 3 finalists in the critics section were all women, and they were all fantastic writers. Manohla Dargis and Stephanie Zaharek, and I think these are names that people kind of recognize and attribute great kind of authority and responsibility for. You've got someone like Wesley Morris at Grantland, who also won the Pulitzer a few years ago. So I think it's a slow process, but I think we're gradually shedding the sort of exclusivity of our reputation. I think Rotten Tomatoes is currently kind of both a very useful and destructive kind of critical tool. I mean, it gathers all our writing and it kind of puts it in one place and gives people very easy access to it. But I also find a lot of people reading Rotten Tomatoes and not actually reading reviews, and kind of mistaking that, so-called consensus that you get like an 85%, of critics like this on Rotten Tomatoes, and mistaking that for kind of general acclaim. And I mean, the biggest problem with it is that there's no nuance. It's like a review is fresh or rotten. And I sometimes have the editors of Rotten Tomatoes like writing to me saying, "We want to put your review up here. We don't know if you'd like to classify it as fresh or rotten or not." And I'm like, the fact that you're asking that question kind of indicates how flawed your system is, because I don't know if the film is fresh or rotten or not. It's neither. So I think encouraging any philosophy that implies a film is either a success or a failure, kind of without any qualification either way, isn't very constructive for the way people think about film. And it also kind of just encourages a lot of hostility among kind of more kind of crazed sort of fanish type of readers who, then target critics who, sully a film's perfect Rotten Tomatoes record or whatever the case may be. I find it slightly troubling that it's become the kind of dominant meter for how people evaluate kind of critical acclaim at the moment. I think Metacritic is attempting to be more nuanced, because I mean the difference between the Metacritic meter and the Rotten Tomatoes meter is they kind of recognize scales of acclaim. I mean, the problem with Rotten Tomatoes is that a film might have a 90% fresh rating, but that 90% is all critics saying, yeah, it's okay, which is very different from a film where 50% of critics think it's a masterpiece and 50% think it's a failure. That is obviously the more acclaimed film, but it's also the more divisive one. So I think Metacritic kind of recognized the possibility of films being polarizing. It's still fundamentally a problem to apply a number to a review. I sometimes see kind of my reviews up there and I'm like, do I really think that's a 100% film? Do I think it's perfect and infallible in every way? But I think they're kind of closer to the mark, and they're trying to kind of keep the conversation a little bit more nuanced. And as they're even more selective than Rotten Tomatoes in who they actually include, which I don't know that they're always picking the right critics, and there may be very good ones who aren't being accounted for. But I think the fact that they're trying to recognize a kind of dominant critical I think the fact they're trying to identify a kind of dominant critical jury, as it were, is interesting and probably for the better in the long run.